Next and the last talk, it's Supply Chain Attacks and Security by Jim. Jim is a technology consultant at Thoughtworks. His focus is on risk analysis and building security into software and infrastructure. Jim is also a chapter leader for OWASP. Over to you, Jim, for the talk.
Cool, thanks, Foti. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good stuff. I'm just going to share my screen as well. Okay, has that worked out right? Can people see my screen?
Yes, we can, Jim.
Okay, good stuff. Well, I'll get started then. So this is a talk about supply chain attacks. It's also a little bit of a story about Solarwinds, which is a particular breach which you may have seen in the news in December of 2020, which brought supply chain attacks to our attention. And what I hope to do is just kind of draw out some of the lessons that breach has taught us, really. So this is me. I think Swati kind of introduced me. I'm cybersecurity engineer out of Thoughtworks, London, in the UK, and typically I'll work with clients who are kind of higher inherent risks, so sort of healthcare, finance, public sector, that kind of thing. Yeah, that's me. I'm a techie by background. So yeah, let's start with Solarwinds. So if you didn't come across it, Solarwinds was a pretty decent global news story in December 2020, which you know, really broke through into mainstream media just due to the extent of the attack. And you know, this gives you a flavour if you weren't familiar with it. This is from the Washington Post. Russian government spies behind a broad hacking campaign that has breached US agencies and a top cyber firm. So attribution is very, very difficult in any kind of cyber attack or cyber breach, because you've got certain groups pretending to be other groups. But this is how the Washington Post came out with it. And there was a lot of similar reporting. And, you know, there's also been, you know, reporting that, you know, the culprit was essentially sort of, you know, nation state, that sort of attack, highly capable, at least. And so, I mean, if you have a look at this article, you can see that the APT29 is called out. So what I've done here is I've just Googled on the MITRE attack website, APT29. Anyone who's not familiar with MITRE attack, it's a wonderful resource, and it's got all kinds of information about different ways of breaching systems and different sort of high-profile groups. You know, both, you know, like AP29 and also, you know, sort of criminal groups, all kinds of groups, really. There's some really good information on it, so I definitely recommend it. But you can see their definition of APT29, also called Cozy Bear or the Dukes, and you'll see some of these names in some of the reporting if you read some of the articles about it. This group was said to be the root cause of it, who are linked with the intelligence services of Russia, and that becomes a bit important, really. So SolarWinds Breach, where do we start? Well, we start off with Orion, which is the SolarWinds. Well, I suppose let's describe it a little bit. The Orion platform is basically a IT management system product platform that is sold by SolarWinds. It's kind of it's probably more aligned to sort of legacy IT rather than sort of cloud native, but it's something that can, you know, draw you pretty graphs and tell you if you've run out of hard disk space and that kind of thing. Yeah, this is essentially the root of the breach, was this SolarWinds Orion platform. And this Orion platform is pretty widely deployed. I've taken this screenshot. It's originally actually from the SolarWinds site, but I've taken it from the Krebs on Security blog, which isn't a bad blog actually, and it's worth a look. And this lists out the customers of the Orion software, and you can see here that you know, all 10 of the top 10 US telecommunications company, all 5 branches of the US military, the Pentagon, the State Department, NASA, NSA, Postal Service, Department of Justice, and the Office of the President of the United States. So, you know, if you'll excuse me the meme, certainly if you were looking to collect information in a stealthy way from those organizations, you're going to be looking at this list and thinking, well, you know, my luck is in with the Orion platform. Okay, so what kind of actually happened? Let's break it down a little bit. So the of the write-ups that are out there, and there are some excellent write-ups, and if you're interested in this stuff, I definitely recommend some of the technical write-ups that have been put together on this breach, because they're really detailed. But the initial attack was on the Solarwinds network, and it was on their build server. So Solarwinds Orion is written in .NET. So it was a .NET build server, and actually the attackers wrote a custom bit of malware and installed it on the build server that did a very targeted and particular thing. This is from a Microsoft write-up, which I've linked here, but the malware was installed onto the build server, and what it did was it watched for my MS Build, which is like a sort of build tool, a little bit like you know, build tools in other languages. It watched out for that process, it grabbed hold of it, and then it looked for this particular source code here, which is part of the Orion malware toolkit. Now, that's kind of interesting because it tells you that the attackers had obviously stolen the code base ahead of time and done detailed analysis on it, so they knew the exact point to insert the code into. And what this does is it installs a backdoor. As it says, we'll start off another thread within when this piece of software starts, and then that kind of will act as a backdoor. So this is extremely sneaky stuff, essentially, both putting the targeted malware on the build server and also targeting particular lines of code, having analyzed you know, the source code of that particular you know, Orion management software. So I suppose one question I just wanted to quickly cover was, how did the malware get onto the build server? Now, there's no public information about that, or not that I've been able to find in any case. My guess is they probably owned an administrator laptop with a phishing attack, maybe a developer laptop, somebody who had access to the build server and control of the build server, and used that to sort of escalate privilege onto the build server. Because typically a build server won't be used for you know, browsing the internet or drive-by downloads and that kind of thing. So it's harder to get stuff onto it. So there might have been an intermediate step where a SolarWinds developer or administrator who had access to the build server had their device owned. And that's something worth thinking about if you've got access to a build server yourself. Yeah, so what happened next? So they put the backdoor into the SolarWinds, into the Orion platform. Of course, on the build server, they had access to the signing key, so they were able to digitally sign that piece of software. And then it was sent for distribution, essentially, to the update website. And at this point, this is where all of the customers who downloaded that breached update, of course, no one knew it was breached at the time, essentially imported a backdoor into their network. All of those hundreds of organizations that used SolarWinds imported that backdoor onto their network at that particular point. And from there, the attackers had a pretty straightforward job that they could go through, connect into each of those customers, do a bit of recon, see if it was an interesting target for them. And if they thought that target had information of interest, they could breach onwards into other services within that network. And from there, they could, you know, this is kind of hands-on attack sort of thing. They could, you know, go into the sort of data they're interested in, you know, whether it be emails, confidential databases, or the rest of it, and then exfiltrate it back to their command and control, which is to say, you know, take that data back to, you know, for analysis and you know, further sort of use. Which you can imagine, if this was an intelligence service that did this, then that could be some quite valuable data. So there we go, I suppose. SolarWinds. I mean, what made it special? What made it relevant to us as software developers? As people who are interested in the security of systems. Well, a couple of things really, and they're not all necessarily the same thing. One thing that was particularly interesting with SolarWinds is it was really carefully targeted. And I think actually it's incredible if you take a step back and think about it. I don't know, maybe the slide shows it quite well, but you know, they were after these confidential emails and confidential databases at SolarWinds customers, but they started off all the way over here on the build server. So there was a big plan here. This wasn't, you know, some teenagers in a bedroom just trying out a SQL injection script. This was very, very targeted, and I think that is significant, because sometimes we kind of think, oh well, these security people are just wearing a tinfoil hat, but this is incredible actually, the level of targeting that went into this. The second one is it's extremely sneaky, extremely sneaky. You know, every step of the way, and I do recommend reading some of the technical write-ups on this, was intended to you know, cover up steps and, you know, sort of make sure they weren't detected. And I'm sure when they were detected and it was in the international media, you know, there were sort of meetings where people were very unhappy and it was seen as a failure. So, you know, I think another learning from this is it was extremely sneaky. And it had a really wide impact, you know, because SolarWinds had so many customers, the impact was huge. And, you know, in terms of incident response at some of the big vendors, you know, it was a big thing. It had a real disruptive effect on the industry. And I remember it well. It was just before Christmas and it was the last thing anybody needed. Yeah, and then the final point, which I think is probably an interesting one, is that SolarWinds used the trusted supply chain as a point of entry. So they weren't pulling the lid off some server on the internet. They weren't using phishing to get into these networks. They were using the supply chain to get in. And I think it's that point primarily which makes the SolarWinds breach really interesting for us, if you like, as software developers. It's this new dynamic, or this highlighted dynamic, because it wasn't a new dynamic, of using the trusted supply chain as a point of entry into networks. Cool. Okay, so let's think a bit harder and let's look a little bit closer at that in that case. So what exactly is this software supply chain that you know, is being talked about, and which was so clearly breached in the SolarWinds case? Let's unpack that a little bit. Well, I mean, software isn't oil, right? It's not some, you don't just drill a hole in the ground and, you know, software kind of comes flooding out. Software is typically written by software developers, and there's a dependency tree, if you like, if you want to see it that way. There's always a set of things which support the creation of software. There's a bunch of things that are in that supply chain that need to go into it. And yeah, I would argue software developers is a key one, you and I and the rest of the industry. There's also the endpoint devices and networks that support that software development activity, that, you know, writing code, committing it in, you know, building it and testing it and the rest of it. There's the source management servers that actually store the source code, you know, do your pull requests, all that kind of thing. There's the continuous integration servers, you know, some of the other talks have talked about pipelines, that kind of thing. There's all of that infrastructure that goes into it. So already we're starting to build up a dependency tree of the software that we put together. It's not just something that comes into being magically. There's a whole supply chain that goes into that. And we all know that supply chain, we don't write software from scratch. You know, we build on top of software frameworks or third-party libraries. You know, we'll download those from distribution mechanisms, like, you know, in Python it's pip. You know, you've got Maven. In Java land, you know, there's these distribution mechanisms. You know, the Linux distributions that you run on your EC2 servers come from a distribution mechanism. So there's a huge amount of things that any single piece of software is depending on, with all of those frameworks and libraries. So actually this dependency tree is potentially getting quite big. But I I think the really mind-boggling thing is what happens when you look at each one of those software frameworks or third-party libraries. That itself will have a series of software developers and a series of laptops that are being used and a series of source code management servers and continuous integration servers. And they will be using other software frameworks and third-party libraries and distribution mechanisms. And so it's almost, well, it's recursive. It's in that there's a potentially very long tree and a huge graph of dependencies in any single, the simplest hello world piece of software might have, a sort of huge graph like this of dependencies, and that's terrifying, really. And it's terrifying because any one of those software developers could be malicious. Any one of those laptops could be compromised. Any source code server could be owned. Any CI server could be exploited. There could be malware in the software frameworks that you're using. There could be malware injected to third-party libraries, and the distribution mechanisms could be compromised. So this is a quote actually that I've taken from a report by the Atlantic Council, which is actually a really good report. I'd recommend this, Breaking Trust. It's a PDF, and you can just get it from their website. Atlantic Trust are kind of, I suppose they're kind of a little bit national security. I think that's their angle and policy, but there's actually some good technical detail in that report. And so if you're into that kind of thing, I would definitely recommend this report. I'm just going to read this out. The state of security in the software supply chain is inadequate. It's quite a strong statement. The state of security in the software supply chain is inadequate, and in some critical respects is getting worse. Attackers are capitalizing on vulnerable software supply chains. Of course, Solarwinds is one example of that, and are able to impact large numbers of critical systems. And if you go and read some of the write-ups of Solarwinds, you'll realize, some of those critical systems are essentially, and what the risk is. So yeah, I think there's a lot has been bandied around in the media around supply chain attacks, but the point that I would really want to sort of push home is this kind of recursive nature and this huge attack surface that goes into any modern piece of software, just because things are so highly abstracted, if you like. Probably in the 70s, people were writing software in machine code and low-level languages. Now we want to say hello world, and we're going to at least import Python to do that, which has got a huge amount of dependencies. The scale of the attack surface of any simple piece of software is huge, and I think it does as well as software developers to realize that, and to really take this point that the Atlantic Council are making quite seriously, which is that probably the security of that supply chain is inadequate if we're going to be using these systems for running healthcare systems or finance systems or protecting information of individuals that can have a high impact and a high risk. Cool. Okay, so next part. So having sort of laid that on thick, if you like, let's talk about what can my team do to manage this risk. Now, I would say don't take this as like the exhaustive list of everything that can be done. This is just some things that have come to me that I wanted to share, really. I would say some of the earlier excellent talks, a lot of the things you've heard in there as well are going to be relevant to this. But yeah, I just wanted to give a few thoughts on what can be done to manage the risk. And so I'm going to start off with the risk of an exploited developer endpoint and device. So what I wanted to do was, rather than just focus explicitly on the risk of dependencies, which I'll come on to, I wanted to focus as well on some of those other elements of the supply chain that came out in SolarWinds particularly. And I think developer endpoints and devices is something that sometimes isn't thought about enough by software developers. And so I wanted to highlight it. Because if you go onto MITRE and you read some of these reports, APT groups do routinely target endpoints. They'll go after laptops. I mean, encryption works pretty well, right? So actually intercepting traffic as it flows across the internet is difficult. Servers tend to be well protected. So Going after laptops or devices is easy because you can do phishing or you can do drive-by downloads, you can do that kind of thing. So very commonly, devices are the sort of first step in the exploitation chain, if you like. And very often developers and DevOps people have got deep access to production. So if you've never thought about your laptop as a target, it is. And I think I wanted to highlight that as part of this talk, particularly as we're talking about SolarWinds. Often, managed devices are a pain, oh, what's the point in running AV, all the rest of it. Internet traffic filtering is even worse, but in certain environments, with certain risk profiles, this stuff is really important actually. Along with actually dialing back some of the privilege level, that you'd have, trying to work as a developer without full admin rights can actually protect you against malware, which is then used to, go on and exploit whatever software service you're building. So yeah, all of that stuff that often sits with the IT department is important. And I wanted to flag that really. If you're a developer who has got admin rights in production, then don't do it, don't do it from your home computer. Do you know what I mean? Don't do it from your personal device. Use a strong device. Ideally, if you've got access to production or a system that can commit, security enforcing code into the core of the system, do that from a well protected device, and be aware that that software is a weak spot. And also be aware that devices will always get owned, and so for that reason, a security review process of your code as it's coming through. Ram referred to this, that 2 pairs of eyes principle, particularly on sensitive parts of the code base, is really important, because when you get a commit coming in, that commit might be coming from an own device rather than the person whose name is on it, if that makes sense. So do give that some thought, particularly if it's in a kind of high threat context. Yeah, a second one that I just wanted to mention, because I don't think as software developers we think about it all the time, is the risk of a malicious development team member. And I mean, it's an awkward one, because I think software developers in the large, and maybe this is just my good experience, you tend to have a good team camaraderie, and you do tend to end up trusting a lot of your co-workers and the rest of it. But angry employees can act out. It does happen. It is a real thing. So that a lot of that stuff around people, investing in people, caring for people's welfare can actually have a positive security effect, because you know that somebody isn't going to potentially act out, or maybe, maybe if someone's got problems with money or, a drug issue or something like that, then, they could take, they could be manipulated into putting something into a very sensitive piece of software, or a piece of software that is distributed. So if you've got something as widely deployed as SolarWinds and as Orion, then thinking about background checks is probably a good idea, to be honest. Yeah, and again, multiple pairs of eyes on stuff coming through. It's not about not trusting people; it's a case of trust and verify. So, and particularly on sensitive parts of the code base. I mean, Marion was talking about SCPs in AWS, which is like a security enforcing part of the code base for sure. Like, definitely you'd want to have 2 pairs of code, 2 pairs of eyes on that, because that would be the first thing that someone would try and bypass if they wanted to disable the security review process. So yeah. Right, so coming a bit more down to bread and butter now as software developers and DevOps people and the rest of it. CI and source code servers are production servers, right? I mean, I think this has been referred to in other sort of discussions, but if someone, we saw with SolarWinds that it was the build server that was targeted. Configure access control properly. I mean, I thought Marion's point with the star, it's easy to put a star, but you're going to regret it later. It's the same thing with any authentication and authorization configuration. Like, get it right. If you're going to run a CI server, if you're going to run pipelines, lock them down, configure it based on least access, because that's how malicious code will be committed in, added to the system. That's how a backdoor will be added. So yeah, I cannot stress that enough. If you've got SCM or CI servers, then make sure that you're configuring the access control correctly. Yeah, deployers. I mean, I suppose make sure that you've got good separation between production and test. Really, just administer your systems properly. CI and source code are backdoors into your system. They are production systems. If you can get code into source code and you can get that code into production, that's the same as production access. And so treat it that way. You know, if anyone can add a dependency without any audit, then you know that's a massive accident waiting to happen. So yeah, really protect your infrastructure, harden your CI server, source code server, and just be aware that, you know, if there is a targeted attack, they're going to explicitly go after these CI servers. And if anyone ever challenges you and say, oh well, what example have you ever heard of a build server getting attacked? Well, you know, there's the Solarwinds. Okay, and this is now coming on to, you know, probably one of the big issue for the industry, I suppose, which is the dependency and the third party malicious library issue. And as always, there's an XKCD cartoon which captures it perfectly, which is this one: dependency. You know, all modern infrastructure is sat on top of, you know, a project some random person in Nebraska has been tirelessly maintaining since 2003. And this highlights it really. And so this is just a bunch of tips that I've got, things that you can do. I don't think this is often realized, but less is more. There's the story, I don't know, I can't remember actually if it was JavaScript or Ruby on Rails, is one of the two. It might be Node actually, where there was like a library that really didn't do very much. I think it was like a left pad or something like that. And it could have, it was sort of one line of code. And it was actually a vulnerability that ended up taking half the internet offline. If you don't need to use a library, then there's a big security benefit in not using it. So less is more really. Often, you know, you can end up, you know, I've seen many cases where developers have pulled things in. You know, they basically Googled a problem, they pulled in a library to fix it, and actually there's a core library that did the same thing, you know. So just be really mindful when adding a dependency, and think, do we need it? You know, and maybe check with other members of the team and say, do we really need this dependency? Because every time we pull something else into the software supply chain, we're increasing our attack surface, you know, possibly exponentially, right? Because of this recursive effect. So less is more. I really want to get that point across. Yeah, I mean, check the provenance of what you're going to pull in. I mean, I suppose, you know, if it's Python core or if it's like Node, then you can go and you can see, you know, or Linux for that matter, you know, the Linux kernel, you can see there's a huge infrastructure already built around the provenance of that, which you can go and have a look at. But if you're pulling in some library, you know, from the open source or something like that, just do a bit of due diligence. You know, when was it last updated? Is this going to get reasonable security updates? You know, who's behind it? Is there a community behind it? Is there a roadmap for it? Just do a little bit of due diligence when you kind of you know, are checking a particular library out really. Yeah, get stuff from established places, you know, Maven Central, whatever it is idiomatically within of your sort of ecosystem. You know, don't just obviously pull things down from random FTP sites or, you know, random S3 buckets. You know, make sure you're getting software from trusted places, and use code signing where it's available, and make sure that you're checking on that. Yeah, run dependency checkers and scanners. I mean, there's quite a few now. I mean, there's paid for ones like Sneak, OWASP have their dependency check, Aqua. I mean, there's quite a few. Those tools have built-in stuff to tell you if there's a problem with dependencies. So they do give you a little bit of a safety net. So do look at some of those tools that are out there. You know, some of the stuff that built into GitHub recent, I think this year, some of the stuff that was added this year, maybe it was last year, it's really good as well. So do use tools, and I think Ram touched on some of that in his talk. Yeah, and again, 2 pairs of eyes, right? I mean, if you're adding a dependency, then do it mindfully, right? I mean, it probably shouldn't be the case that a developer can join your team and commit a dependency into production the first week that they're there, right? There probably should be a process that you've got around adding dependencies to your software where you talk about it as a team. Do we need this dependency? Do we not need that dependency? That kind of thing, really. So yeah, and review. You know, raising a pull request is auditable. You know, it can be discussed. You can see what happens if the worst does happen. It helps you with the audit. So some stuff like short-lived pull requests and an audit is really important in that space. Again, that two pairs of eyes, sort of principle. It's not about segregation of duties. It's about two pairs of eyes, just to make sure that the security affecting changes are safe, really. Cool. So that's my thought on what we can do as developers to improve things. I just want to close off by talking about some things that the industry can do, some things that are kind of emerging, that are kind of exciting, just to sort of signpost those for you, really. So software bill of materials is a really exciting opportunity for supply chain risks, essentially. So what is a software bill of materials? So essentially, these are a set of tools that can create a list of components in your software, a little bit of those, those sort of dependency graphs that I was showing. It will essentially, for each one of those nodes, it helps you reason about their trustworthiness. They can have a score and say, okay, this is a really trustworthy dependency, or this isn't. But you can also sort of recurse through the graph and say, okay, well, what about for dependencies of the dependency and the dependency of the dependency of the dependency, if that makes sense. So really quite a powerful approach, using sort of digital signatures to provide integrity. Loads of good technical detail if you go and Google some of these approaches. There's a few emerging. These aren't the only three, but OWASP Cyclone DX is one. The Linux Foundation has SPDX, and Google has recently taken their approach, which is called SELSA, into alpha. And the comms around SELSA is really good. So I'm just gonna share a little bit of that just to give you an idea of it. I mean, they've developed this pretty good sort of threat model of developer, source code build, packaging, dependencies. They define different levels of protection: basic protection, medium protection, advanced protection. So it's kind of relative to your threat model. Maybe basic protection is good for a hobby site or something like that, whereas maximum protection might be more your sort of FS, healthcare, sort of targeted domain. Yeah, like I say, they've built quite a nice sort of threat model around it, which is really worth a look. Yeah, I mean, all of this stuff is emerging, really. So have a look at it. The SELSA framework, this is it, selsa.dev. It's a bit like Kubernetes in that Google had Borg internally at Google, and then they sort of repackaged it for external use, if you see what I mean. So they used Borg internally, and then they created Kubernetes for the community, if you see what I mean, for the broader industry. And this is similar. Google, I believe, are already using something like SELSA internally and have been for several years, for quite a long time. And this is like the repackaging of it for outside. And you can see it's actually pretty good. If you go through it, you can, even if you don't use SELSA, you can use some of these controls. It's quite granular, if you sort of mean. These are the requirements around source control. Is it version control? Do you have a change history? Is it immutable? So I definitely recommend this as a kind of emerging resource to kind of check out if you like. I would caution though on SBOM approaches. I mean, they're emerging, they're really exciting, they have the potential to fix some of this stuff. But there's one major problem with SBOM, which is very pithily captured in a deck which I've shared here, which is for SBOM, success requires non-trivial adoption. And I like that because it's very pithy, but it's a little bit difficult to unpack. What that means is, if SBOM is going to work, everyone needs to adopt it. So if you're going to get a benefit of SBOM, then everyone in your supply chain needs to have adopted SBOM. And we're a long way from that. With any of the tools, there's not widespread adoption. So SBOM is a great idea, but to be successful, it does require adoption, which unfortunately is non-trivial. The way I think about it is a bit like Facebook. Like the reason that Facebook's so successful is because everyone's on it. I mean, WhatsApp as well, right? But until everyone's on it, you can create a new social network, but if nobody's on it, you don't get the benefit from it. It's a network effect. And SBOM really leverages that network effect. And until it's widely rolled out, I mean, Celsa's in alpha at the moment. There's a long way to go, really. So yeah, I mean, that I would caution with SBOM. It's not going to solve your problem straight away, but it's a really, really interesting and useful approach, I think, for the future. Cool. And this is just where I wanted to end, really. So I think as well as technical approaches, there's a culture change that's needed in the industry if we're going to defend against some of these highly targeted, supply chain based, sneaky attacks, right? So, and in my experience, too often as an industry, we don't think before adding a dependency, for example. Like, I've definitely seen developers add dependencies and not think about security at all. And that's probably a culture issue when you think about it in terms of the impact that breaches can have. Even just that 2 pairs of eyes, which has been talked about, in a number of different talks, review of changes that are coming through, particularly security affecting ones. Often developers sort of throw their hands up. Oh, does that mean we can't do pair programming? Oh, that means we can't do continuous integration. Oh, this is just security theater. We need to change that attitude. We need to embrace these things positively and recognize that the systems that we build, do introduce a lot of risk into the world. And actually, those 2 pairs of eyes, that care, that diligence can make a real impact. Another example, DevOps doesn't mean everyone has root access in production. DevSecOps certainly doesn't mean that. Of course, we want people to have the access they need, least privileged. We want visibility. We want everyone to take ownership. But we need to think about locking things down, and we need to think about safety because, devices can be owned just as much as people are malicious. So we need to be aware of the threat landscape. So care and vigilance is something I'd really, really highlight. Yeah, and this is, is a bit silly, but these are just 2, coming back all the way around to SolarWinds. These are just 2 things that popped up on Twitter, which maybe are indicative of a culture, right? Which is, this is a security researcher who, before the breach, had highlighted that they'd committed their password for their FTP site into GitHub in a public repo. Sure, they had code signing, but it's on reflection, it's sloppy. Equally, this guy he said, look, SolarWinds are advising their customers to disable antivirus. Now, I do think we should be careful of this because obviously SolarWinds has been breached, but it's an interesting thought experiment. Think about it. If the worst happened to your project or to your company or to your service, what would you be looking back on and saying, oh, that was actually sloppy. We should have fixed that. We weren't careful enough. We weren't vigilant enough. Because that's risk management, right? And so I think these 2, quite agreed, the SolarWinds 1, 2, 3, that's pretty bad on reflection. But take that and think about what is it on your service. If the worst did happen, you'd be looking back on and think, oh, that could have been better. We could have had stronger protections there. Yeah, and this is just my final call to action, really, which is that improving the security of the software supply chain won't happen unless we all prioritize it. And we are the industry, so people on this call, people listening, software developers, and we do need to redouble our care and vigilance if we're going to be able to protect against the current threat and the threat in the future as well. Cool, and that's it actually. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jim, for the talk. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A section. Can you take a look, please?
Yeah, so what should developers do to avoid endpoint attacks? That's from Jag. So I think there's typically going to be an IT department, right, who's going to manage the devices. One thing developers can do, I mean, in order to develop, to run the Docker daemon or to download stuff and all the rest of it, developers typically have quite high levels of privilege. I think one thing all developers can do is just not disable stuff. Often you can disable antivirus, or you can, you want to get a server running on port 80, so you disable the firewall. that could be the hole that is then used for onward exploitation into your build server. So I would say, think about, if you are a developer, like, be mindful of the trust that's given to you in having a sort of more open and less locked down device. And don't play StarCraft 2 on your dev device. Don't BitTorrent. I mean, this should just be obvious, right? Because it's illegal. But don't if you're going to browse Reddit links, then think about doing that from a personal iPad or a personal Android device or something like that. So yeah, I'm not advocating that developers go and get their heads fully stuck into the IT world and the world of endpoint device management, but just be mindful of some of the privilege you've got, and don't do stupid stuff. Yeah. Okay, we've got another one here. If a breach is identified, what is the procedure in place to notify vendors or the customer? That's a really good question. So this is going to vary massively, right? So I'm in the UK, where equally Marion's in Germany, where GDPR is active. It's going to vary. I mean, number one, depending on what region you're in, who the regulator are, and the rest of it. It's going to depend what organization you're working for. It's going to depend on the supplier structure. It's going to depend on contractors. So it really is it depends. I think the one thing I would say is you need to have a procedure. And if you don't have one, then put one in place. If you're not senior enough, or I suppose in that role where it's your job to do that, then go and badger the people who are responsible and accountable and the rest of it. Because having an incident response plan and a breach, a plan of what you're going to do when there's a breach, is something you want done ahead of time, not when the worst happens. And the worst will happen, not necessarily to you, but it does happen every day. So yeah, I guess go and find out if you don't already have it, and write it down in an incident response plan would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Jim. There's one more question in the chat. It's, would logging, monitoring, and alerting help in detecting the supply chain attacks and probably reduce the longer impact?
Definitely. Yeah, I almost added it. I mean, it's always time, isn't it? But I wanted to double down on SBOM approaches and the sort of care and vigilance point. I think that detection is going to be the big thing over the next 10 years that's going to grow and grow and grow. Ram highlighted, the role of security operations center, and high threat organizations have had this for years. But yeah, I think particularly logging and monitoring of the build system, if you see what I mean, and having incident response based on events that are generated around the supply chain and around the build, is just something that I haven't seen done to a level of maturity that I think we need to reach. And it's just such a massive opportunity. If Solarwinds had detected that malware on their build server, then this mega breach wouldn't have happened. So yeah, I think massive area of interest, and I don't see enough pennies dropping that monitoring the build server for security is just a massive win area where you're going to detect. Because think about it, if we know attackers are targeting developer devices and build servers, we should be security monitoring those, right, as well as the websites and the production services. So yeah, definitely +1 is going to be a massive area of growth, I think.
There's one more question in the Q&A, Jim, if you can answer that too.
Yeah, okay. What method do you suggest to make the developers understand who doesn't want to agree with the security team, and then a vulnerability is reported to them? Yeah, so I'm going to, hopefully I've interpreted this right. I think I'm going to take that as a little bit of a question about culture. I do quite often see like a bit of a divide between security people who security is their job and developers who are massively incentivized to deliver. To be honest, we all probably recognize that. I think it is difficult because I've seen both sides of the fence. As a security person, you get to see the reality of breaches, and you get to know that it's not tinfoil hat wearing and there are real threats. And that's why I wanted to try and tell the story of SolarWinds in terms that people could understand, or that, you know, would be, it's technical enough that it's interesting for developers to sort of get people's imaginations going. So I think telling stories about breaches is incredibly powerful. For a more concrete approach, I would definitely recommend threat modeling, get the developers involved and the security people, just having everybody looking each other in the eye and kind of, you know, working together, you know, rather than just sending passive aggressive emails and Excel documents to each other can really do wonders. So yeah, anything that's collaborative would be my recommendation. Cool, that's it. Well, if there's no other questions, just thanks to the organisers and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jim, for answering all the questions.